I made my boss's daughter cry in public after years of swallowing humiliations that almost made me forget who I was. When I look back at how it all began, the first feeling isn't anger, it's exhaustion. An exhaustion that doesn't go away with a night's sleep, or a collective vacation, or empty promises that things will get better. I used to wake up already tired, as if the day had started before I even opened my eyes. My phone would vibrate before sunrise, during breakfast, in the shower, and while I was trying to pretend I still had a life outside that clinic. I managed everything. Absolutely everything. People, schedules, crises, spreadsheets, conflicts, absences, delays, and mistakes that weren't mine. 15 employees depended directly on me to keep the chaos from swallowing the place whole. And yet I was treated as if I were disposable, as if my effort were an obligation and my exhaustion were just drama. I became the kind of person who didn't turn off their phone, even during collective vacations. I remember sitting in a place that was supposed to mean rest, trying to convince my own body that I could relax, while my mind was trapped in endless calls, urgent messages, and problems that only I seemed capable of solving. It was as if the company breathed through me. If I stopped, everything stopped. And at the same time, no one seemed to care if I was on the verge of collapsing. In the beginning, I called it responsibility. Later, I started calling it commitment. Only much later did I have the courage to call it by its real name, abuse. Pamela entered my life like a hurricane without a purpose. As the daughter of the clinic's owner, she had no clear role, no training, and no boundaries. She only had the absolute certainty that she was in charge of everything. And everyone. The way she moved through the hallways was almost theatrical, as if every step were a reaffirmation of power, every glance a silent reminder that she could humiliate anyone she wanted without consequences. Her tone was never one of leadership, it was contempt. She spoke to employees as if she were speaking to defective objects. And worse, she did it in front of everyone. I watched. I always watched. At first, I tried to intervene discreetly, to smooth things over, to put out emotional fires before they grew. I told myself I was protecting the team. But deep down, I was protecting the system that was hurting us. Every time I saw the problem Pamela created, I reinforced her belief that she could keep going. Lucy, my boss, watched it all with a neutrality that hurt more than her daughter's direct attacks. She had the cruel gift of pretending she didn't see, hear, or understand. When someone cried, she called it oversensitivity. When someone complained, she called it a lack of professionalism. When I tried to explain what was happening, she would sigh, as if I were bringing her unnecessary problems. Lucy didn't scream. She invalidated, and that hurts in a silent, deep, corrosive way. Over time, I started feeling something strange inside me. It wasn't just tiredness. It was a constant state of alert, as if something bad was always about to happen. My body lived in tension. My stomach ached for no apparent reason. I would relive scenes from work before bed, in the shower, while trying to watch anything just to switch off my mind. I asked myself, repeatedly, at what point I had accepted living that way. At what point I decided this was normal. The humiliations became routine. Side comments, looks of disdain, public demands made on purpose to expose people. Pamela took an almost visible pleasure in belittling others. And the more someone showed fragility, the more she squeezed. Employees would walk out of rooms with red eyes and trembling voices, trying to pretend everything was fine. I saw it. I felt it. And I carried the guilt of not being able to stop it. There were days when I locked myself in the bathroom, just to breathe. I would lean my forehead against the cold door and ask myself how much longer I could take it. I told myself I needed the job, that the bills wouldn't wait, that leaving without a plan was irresponsible. But behind those justifications, there was a greater fear, the fear of admitting that I was being destroyed in there. It was in this setting that I started paying more attention to what was wrong. Not out of courage, but for survival. My eyes began to see details I used to try to ignore. Expired medications kept as if they were nothing. Spoiled food in places that should have been safe. Procedures done haphazardly, without the slightest care. And above all, people being treated like trash. People crying in secret, people getting sick, people slowly losing their spark. At first, I filmed things almost without thinking. It was automatic, a strange impulse, as if some part of me knew that this couldn't just vanish into thin air. I told myself it was to protect myself, to have proof in case something went wrong. But deep down, I felt I was recording the truth that everyone pretended not to see. Every video was an extra weight on my conscience, but also a small, dangerous flame growing inside me. Pamela, on the other hand, seemed increasingly confident. The more responsibility I took on, the more comfortable she felt crossing boundaries. She started acting as if even the employees' personal lives were hers to manage. Schedules, children, commitments. Everything was a reason for control, demands, and humiliation. I watched that and felt something break inside me. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone. There was one specific day when I realized I wasn't the same person anymore. A seemingly ordinary day. The phone ringing non-stop, problems cropping up one after another, Pamela spreading tension through the halls. But something in me was different. I didn't just feel fear or exhaustion. I felt anger. A silent, organized, almost cold anger. It was the first time I didn't try to justify their behavior. The first time I thought, with terrifying clarity, that this had to end. I started putting it all together. Videos, situations, accounts, images that no one ever wanted to see. And as I did, one question hammered in my head. How many more people would have to cry before someone said enough? How many more humiliations would be normalized before the truth came out? I didn't know how, or when, or in what way it would all explode. But I felt it. I felt it in the weight in my chest, in the constant tension, in the heavy silence of the hallways. Something was building up, and I was at the center of it all, holding on to more than any human being should ever have to hold. At that moment, without realizing it, I had already crossed the point of no return. I didn't realize immediately that I was already living in survival mode. To me, it had simply become my routine. Waking up with a racing heart, checking my phone before even getting out of bed, feeling a tightness in my chest just imagining the day ahead. I wasn't just walking into the clinic anymore. I was crossing an emotional minefield. Every hallway seemed to carry echoes of past humiliations. Every room had a bad memory stuck to its walls. And I kept moving forward, day after day, pretending that it wasn't eating me alive inside. What scared me the most wasn't Pamela's explicit cruelty, but the casualness with which it all happened. It was as if emotional violence had become part of the air we breathed in there. Employees would arrive tense, speaking in low voices, moving with excessive caution. I recognized that behavior because it lived in me, too. I measured my words, controlled my expressions, and anticipated explosions that didn't always come, but could strike at any moment. Living like that wears out your soul. Pamela seemed to feed off it. The more fear she sensed around her, the more she grew. She would appear out of nowhere, interrupt tasks, create problems where none existed, and demand immediate solutions for mistakes she had caused herself. And she did it all with a crooked smile, with the air of someone who knows she will never be confronted. I watched and felt a mix of indignation and helplessness. Part of me wanted to scream. Another part just wanted to vanish. Lucy continued her role of active absence. She appeared when it was convenient and disappeared when the tension spiked. And when she did show up, she always had a rehearsed speech ready about professionalism, maturity, and commitment. It was impressive how she could transform pain into exaggeration and abuse into a misunderstanding. I began to realize that her stance wasn't naivety. It was a choice. She chose to protect her daughter, even if it meant destroying people. Over time, the videos on my phone began to multiply. I filmed open drawers with expired products, refrigerators with spoiled food, environments that shouldn't have been operating that way. I filmed empty hallways after silent crises. I filmed my own shaking hands, not because I meant to show myself, but because I couldn't help it. It all felt like a silent confession, a diary that couldn't be written with words. What stayed with me most were the faces. Faces of good, hardworking, honest people, slowly being broken. People who arrived full of drive and, within a few months, were exhausted, unmotivated, and insecure. I saw employees crying in secret, wiping away tears before returning to their posts, apologizing for emotions that should never have been a source of guilt. And every time it happened, something inside me screamed that I had to do something. But fear still held me back. Fear of losing my job, fear of retaliation, fear of not being believed. I wondered if anyone would stand by me or if I would be painted as the problem employee, the ungrateful one, the one who exaggerates. That kind of fear is a heavy silence. It paralyzes you. It makes you accept the unacceptable for much longer than you should. Feeling untouchable, Pamela began to cross lines more aggressively. She didn't just humiliate, she tested. She tested reactions, provoked conflicts, and pitted employees against one another. She created a toxic environment where no one trusted anyone. And at the center of it all, I tried to maintain some order, some dignity, even while feeling like I was alone in this battle. There were days when I thought about giving up, about simply not showing up anymore, about turning off my phone and disappearing. But there was always something that pulled me back. A plea for help, a tired look, a sense of responsibility I couldn't abandon. I hated that part of myself, the part that endured too much. But at the same time, it was that very part that was waking up to the truth. It was during this period that I began to understand the scale of what was happening. It wasn't just a bad workplace. It was an entire system built on fear, silence, and exploitation. And I was part of it, even against my will. That realization brought me shame. Shame for having accepted so much. Shame for having normalized what should never be normal. But it also brought clarity. A painful clarity, but a necessary one. My internal dialogue became a battlefield. One voice told me to keep going, to endure, to not cause trouble. Another voice, newer, firmer, asked how much longer I would betray myself to keep everyone else's peace. I relived old scenes. I remembered every time I was belittled, ignored, or disrespected. And for the first time, I didn't try to justify it. I just felt it. The atmosphere grew even heavier as rumors, veiled comments, and threats disguised as advice began to emerge. I noticed different looks, whispers that stopped when I walked by. Not because they suspected anything concrete, but because the tension was universal. Everyone felt that something was wrong, even without knowing exactly what. It was as if the clinic were on the brink of an invisible collapse. I started sleeping poorly. I dreamed of endless hallways, doors that wouldn't open, and phones that wouldn't stop ringing. I would wake up sweating, my heart pounding. My body was giving clear signs that I was past my limit. Constant headaches, nausea, shortness of breath. Even so, I kept going, because stopping meant facing everything I had been avoiding. Amidst the silent chaos, something changed permanently inside me. It wasn't one big event. It was a sequence of small, accumulated violences, a weight that finally became unbearable. I found myself looking at Pamela and no longer feeling fear. I felt contempt, and that shift was terrifying, because when fear leaves, it makes room for irreversible decisions. I still didn't know exactly how it would all go down, but I felt I was preparing for something big, something there would be no coming back from. Every video recorded, every situation documented, every tear witnessed turned into fuel. I was tired of carrying it alone, tired of pretending I was strong while I was falling apart inside. The business kept running, seemingly normal to anyone looking in from the outside. But on the inside, everything was rotten. And I, who held that structure up, was no longer sure I wanted to keep doing it. The question haunting me now wasn't whether I could take it anymore, but whether I could live with myself if I stayed silent. That was when I realized the confrontation was no longer a distant possibility. It was closing in, and when it arrived, it wouldn't be quiet. I was no longer trying to survive. I was preparing to break free. That difference changes everything. The fear was still there, but it no longer commanded my movements. It walked beside me like a tired shadow, while something else, something much more powerful, grew inside of me. A cold lucidity, an almost terrifying clarity. I began to see the clinic for what it truly was, not what I pretended it to be. A place held up by exhausted people, governed by vanity, cruelty, and bought silence. Every step I took through those hallways carried a different weight. I knew too much. I had seen too much. I had recorded too much. And the more conscious I became of it, the harder it was to keep pretending things were normal. The environment seemed to sense this shift. Pamela was more irritable, more aggressive, as if she realized something was slipping out of her control. Lucy remained distant, but now her absence had an air of alert, like someone who knows a storm is gathering but chooses not to look at the sky. The day everything started to crumble, didn't seem special at first glance. It was an ordinary day full of tasks, demands, and petty conflicts. My phone vibrated as usual. My mind tried to keep up with everything at once. But inside, something was different. I was no longer trying to please. I was no longer molding myself to fit. I simply existed, whole, tired, and aware. Pamela appeared as usual, spreading tension through the air. She wasn't screaming that day. She was doing something worse. She was being sarcastic, belittling, questioning decisions she herself never knew how to make. She demanded explanations in public, with that sickly pleasure of exposing others. I felt the employees' eyes on me, a mix of fear and expectation. They had seen this movie before. What they didn't know was that, this time, the ending would be different. As she spoke, something inside me aligned. Every past humiliation, every hidden tear, every sleepless night, it all organized itself in my head like pieces of a cruel puzzle. I didn't feel explosive rage. I felt calm, a dangerous calm, the kind of calm that precedes life-altering decisions. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I didn't lose control. And that was what destabilized her the most. For the first time, Pamela didn't find resistance in the form of fear, nor submission in the form of silence. She found a mirror that reflected exactly who she was. And she couldn't stand it. She cried. She cried out of rage, out of frustration, out of helplessness. She cried because the power she had always exercised without effort slipped through her fingers in seconds. She cried because the mask fell in front of everyone. She cried because, in that moment, she ceased to be untouchable. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. No one moved. No one looked away. It was as if everyone needed to watch it to finally believe it was possible. Lucy showed up too late. And when she did, she didn't find her powerful daughter or her obedient employee. She found a scene she had always pretended didn't exist. I saw something rare in her eyes, fear. Not of me, but of the truth. Because the truth, when it surfaces, doesn't pick its targets. It hits everything around it. It was in that moment I understood that what I was doing wasn't revenge. It was justice. Every video I had recorded, every documented irregularity, every silent piece of evidence finally made sense. It wasn't about destroying someone. It was about no longer allowing people to be destroyed daily. I was no longer willing to carry that guilt. The following days were chaotic. Attempts at damage control, empty speeches, late promises. None of it reached me anymore. I had already crossed the point where words lose their power. The atmosphere changed. Not because Lucy and Pamela became better people, but because the fear changed sides. And that is something no one ever forgets. Employees began to breathe differently, to walk with less tension in their shoulders, to speak with more firmness. Some were still afraid, others were hopeful. I watched it all with a mix of relief and sadness. Relief for finally having broken free. Sadness for knowing that none of it ever had to reach this point. When I walked out of there, I didn't leave defeated. I left whole. Tired, yes. Hurting, undoubtedly. But whole. I took with me something no one could take away, the certainty that I didn't stay silent when it mattered most. That I didn't turn my face away from injustice. That I honored not only myself, but everyone else who couldn't speak. Today, when I think about everything I went through, I don't feel pride in the pain. I feel pride in the courage that was born from it. Because no one wakes up wanting to take on an entire system. But there comes a time when staying silent hurts more than speaking up. And that moment changes everything. If you have ever lived through something similar, if you have felt this silent humiliation, this invisible weight, know that you are not alone. Stories like mine are not the exception. They are more common than they seem. And they need to be told. If this story resonated with you, if it touched on something you've lived or witnessed, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had the courage to face someone who thought they would never be confronted? I read everything.